Analyst.
Global security analyst. Okay. Well, hello there, everybody. My name is Matthew Orr. I'm a Eurasia analyst at Rain. I'm here with Charlie. He's one of our global security analysts. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about Sub-Saharan Africa and kind of the implications, ramifications of what's going on in the Eurasia region, what's going on as relates to Russia's war in Ukraine, and the potential implications of that for the region. Um, I think to frame this conversation, Charles, it's helpful for me to think about how back in Soviet times how the Soviet Union thought about Africa. It was a very important continent for them, a very important place for them. This place where colonial empires were receding, and now there was this idea that the Soviet Union could play a positive role and be a big influence, and if they could be the dominant player in this continent, that they could maybe even control the whole world. So went the rosy argumentation. But even since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia never really left Africa and has become more and more involved in recent years. Most notably, that's through this mercenary organization, this Wagner organization. So, I mean, I guess just to kind of kick things off, how big are Wagner's operations in Africa? Like, what the extent of this? Do we have any good idea of kind of the scope? I mean, how many people, how many countries? Is it very transparent, easily tracked?
It's not as transparent as we'd like as far as the number of Wagner mercenaries that are active in Africa. That being said, they are active in at least 18 or have been active in at least 18 countries. Um, the biggest places recently where they've been active, where they have a noteworthy presence, are in Sub-Saharan Africa or Central African Republic, which they've sought to. This is part of Russian government efforts to supplant or otherwise subvert waning French influence. Similarly, with Mali, we've seen in recent
But it's
months.
interesting because the Russians deny that this is a part of a government strategy, right? Whenever
Yep, yep,
Macron or whoever comes to the Kremlin and they ask him about it, and the Kremlin says, well, "Look, these are private organizations. We told Mr. Macron that we can't do much for him there because we don't control these entities. But of course, they are in fact part of a
yep,
government
yep.
controlled effort."
And it's rather suspicious how uh, how, at least in some instances, overt military operations either operate in parallel to Wagner operations or alongside Wagner operations. So we saw that in Mali in particular, where before there were, in addition to early reports of Wagner being on the ground, there were also public reports that Russia was sending overt military support, either helicopters or overt military training missions to Mali as part of its efforts. So wherever Wagner shows up, Russian more overt Russian capabilities aren't usually that far behind, or aren't sometimes at least that far behind. So as much as the Russians may deny it, um, it does appear to at least have some Wagner's activities that certainly have at least some dovetail with Russian official policy.
Mhm.
Um,
And
so yeah.
And so what I mean, so you mentioned Mali and the Sahel region in general, very important to the French, but what specific African countries do you think are most vulnerable or influenced by the activities of Russian mercenary groups? I mean, are there any governments, for example, that one of the implications of Russia's war in Ukraine that we'll maybe get to a little bit later in more detail is rising food prices, right? So you're going to have that's something that can really shake up the socio-political economic situation of these countries. Are there any governments that you think are particularly vulnerable and where they will try to really lean on Russian mercenaries to help them or to do something critical for them? Or
Yeah, so we've talked about Mali in particular being that situation where they've really sought the Russian alternative to to French influence in a big way, and were really counting, particularly on dealing with their jihadist problem, counting on Russian support to deal with that problem. And it looks increasingly likely that they may not be able to uh, count on that support necessarily. There are reports that a Russian Wagner mercenary was actually kidnapped by jihadists in Mali earlier. It was late last week. There's not been confirmation of that yet, but if that is confirmed, it'll be a big embarrassment for the Russians, and it remains to be seen how the Russians will react when um, ostensibly a member of a private organization is taken by
Right.
jihadists.
And
Um,
but just from my kind of background, why do these African governments need Wagner? It's that, for example, the Malian junta can't muster the soldiers on their own to go after jihadists, or they don't have certain capabilities that only Wagner can provide, or could just give us some background on that.
this is my understanding of it is it's a capabilities gap. So they simply don't have the resources or capabilities needed, especially in those more far-flung rural areas where these jihadist groups operate, to really, to maintain control over these areas effectively. And so they need, Wagner as minimum at a, for officially they're there as quote unquote instructors, but certainly need them as a clearing force, if not a holding force. So, and they needed that, and they've needed external involvement since the early 2010s, particularly the Malians. Um, Russia has also, on a propaganda level, tried to make inroads into Burkina Faso, but there's no present evidence of Wagner involvement on the ground there. But they have at least tried to make inroads there from a propaganda standpoint, funneling a lot of social media based misinfo, disinfo in the Burkina Faso space. Again, Burkina Faso also faces a jihadist threat, and they see an opportunity as far as waning French influence. There was a recent coup, so there's uncertainty about how the Burkinabe government's gonna move forward. Um, so they see an opportunity, although it's unclear that they have the resources to exploit it, especially given the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
which I'm sure you can. And I'll ask you that question: how do you see Russia's interests in
Yeah.
Africa and in more far-flung places more broadly, changing or being less prioritized given the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
Do you think they're
Yeah.
still going to be able to
The,
um,
yeah.
walk and chew
Yeah.
gum, so to speak?
I think, in short, I think they will. I think that it's in fact, I think I would argue it's more important. The continent of Africa has become more important for Russia
Um,
relatively as a result of this, right? As
yeah,
Russia cuts off a lot of its economic, diplomat, I mean, just previous relations
yeah,
with Europe. um, it's looking for other places to expand its influence, and it's also looking at a place from which it can show the Europeans why they need Russia and why they're eventually, in however many years, need to come walking back
yeah,
to Russia and repair relations. So one of the reasons that people have speculated about why Russia got involved in Syria, there's obviously multiple reasons, but this ability to cause chaos and use things like refugee flows against Europe to as a leverage point, should use destabilization to distract European attention, resources from the war in Ukraine. I think that's the way that Russia is thinking about these kinds of things, and but also just in a more strategic long term perspective. It's, I mean, going back to what I was saying at the very beginning. I mean, it understands that Africa is this growing continent with all kinds of economic resources and then large population, and a big voting bloc at places like the UN, where Russia has done very poorly
yep,
recently. And so I think Russia is looking at Africa and saying, we this place is more important for us. And whenever we get the resources, and that's the key, the second part that I want to speak to is when they have the resources, this is a place they want to focus on. But the resources is a really interesting question, because I know that Wagner mercenaries have been leaving Africa for Ukraine since the war started. There's been reports that specifically from Libya, a fairly large contingent of Wagner left Libya to go to Ukraine from there. There's very scattered, kind of isolated incidents of individual Wagner employees under contracts, basically backing out of their contracts to go as volunteers to Ukraine. You could see more of that happening in the future, or you could potentially see if Russia's manpower issues got very bad, and that's really the issue for Russia and Ukraine right now, is they have a manpower shortage. And so I think that as that drags on, then some of these African missions could be at danger. But I don't think they will be ended. They will just be toned down a little bit. They'll try to draw some manpower.
One question I thought about, and this is something I didn't mean to blindside you with this question, but Russia is also a big defense exporter to a lot of African states. In terms of defense material. Now that they're probably, with the war in Ukraine, they're going to have to devote a lot of their production to meeting domestic military needs. Is that going to impact their either their ability to export or their capability or the amount of material they have to export to other countries, either a spare parts issue or new systems?
In the short term, absolutely. I mean, there's all kinds of reports also from the Ukrainian intelligence services that the Russian employees are going around their old stockpiles and making sure everything's still there, and double checking that that it hasn't been secretly been stolen over the course of years or something like that. So there are these concerns about what exactly do we have in terms of weapons, because that works two ways. It's not just what can we take out of the stockpiles, it's what do we need to make sure that we're producing plenty of right now. And then, of course, if either of those two sources could potentially draw away from things that could have been exported to African countries. And so, I mean, that's definitely another area of this to watch. And if that's something that forces certain leaders in Africa to have to find different arms providers, then that could be an interesting knock-on effect of this for the region, for sure.
I will note here on the African side of things, African leaders have very much on the political aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war. Many have kind of hedged, for want of a better term. They haven't come out in favor of one side or the other. They've chosen tried to carve a middle path. The countries that
we had a great worldview piece on this, by the way, by Clara, our Africa analyst. I recommend that to our listeners.
Yeah, one country that has been a little bit more, I wouldn't say explicitly pro-Russia, but has been a little more supportive of the Russian position is Sudan, and they've been that way, and mostly as a matter of, so the Sudanese military regime has fairly, their junta has, I would say, somewhat close ties to the UAE and the other Gulf states, and is dependent a lot on that funding. So, and since the UAE has taken more of a friendly, or maybe not friendly, but more of a tried to thread the needle anyway.
No, Sudan is a fascinating one. You probably remember that Russia tried to actually build a naval facility in the port of Sudan. Then once there was the change of government there, what was that, in like 2019 or a couple of years ago? Then that whole thing went on ice. And then once the coup happened in Sudan, it all came back together. Actually, a neighboring state, Eritrea, is one of the few countries that actually, one of the 5 countries, along with I can name them all: Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Syria, and Eritrea, that voted at this big UN resolution on recognizing Ukraine's territorial integrity after the invasion. And what was interesting is that after that, the Eritrean foreign minister came to Moscow, and then there was this announcement of a Russian military logistics center that's going to be in Eritrea now. So, Russia feels like it's getting some certain, scratching its back and getting some benefit from its work with these African countries. So that's an interesting announcement.
And to be fair, and this is more on a public perspective, I haven't seen any close cooperation. The Ethiopians, as far as the Tigray conflict is concerned, have also I wouldn't necessarily say, not necessarily say they're pro-Russia, but they've certainly tried to hedge more on the Russia-Ukraine war. hedging more towards the Russian side of things.
Yeah.
And then also we've seen in South Africa where they've also been a little bit more neutral on their, at least tried to thread that needle.
Yeah.
So from a political perspective, we see the African countries feeling a dependency on Russia, whether or not that dependency is entirely accurate. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the food issue, and that is certainly a big reason. So Russia and Ukraine combined both provide large amounts of wheat and oil and other key staples for the third world, Middle East, and North African countries. I just wrote a
Yeah.
report recently on Iraq, which they depend on Ukraine for 32% of their oil imports, their seed oil imports
Yeah.
in particular. So this is a major problem for these African countries. They don't have alternative sources to be able to feed themselves.
Yeah. And this kind of topic is still, I think, really in its infancy, because we haven't really felt the full effects of it yet. We're going to start feeling, I think, more as this drags on over the coming months. Ukraine has about a third of its farmland is going to go unplanted, and then a fairly large percentage of that, possibly 10 to 20% of what is planted, might not be harvested, either due to conflict or just due to the economically unfeasible to harvest the planted food. And so you're looking at potentially a 50% or more hit to Ukraine's production. And then if you look at the export possibilities, it falls off because Ukraine is under complete naval blockade. But more than 50% of Ukraine's imports and exports used to take place via the Black Sea. And of course, something like 90% of the grain exports all took place via ocean, via the Black Sea. Specifically, actually, the Azov ports that are now under Russian control, places like Berdyansk and Mariupol, and then to a lesser extent Odessa in the west. But I mean, all of that is unfeasible right now. So presumably, even the little bit of grain that is being done would have to be by rail sent out to the EU and then out, and that's just a logistical nightmare. And so it's looking like a huge piece of agricultural production is not going to reach these global markets. And so we think about the countries at risk. The ones that come to mind first are places like Egypt. But it's interesting. I mean, I guess my question for you is that are there any other countries that kind of pop up for you, or specifically ones in Sub-Saharan Africa that maybe might not come to mind for people at first?
Well, my understanding, and this is from talking with our Africa analyst Clara, is Kenya is vulnerable. Somalia has already started to see, not from the Russia-Ukraine war so much, but more due to local conditions. They've got a massive drought, and Somalia is already experiencing food shortages. So obviously, the Somalia has been a perennial problem for a long time, but there is concern about especially given al-Shabaab's persistent activities in Somalia. There is concern that they may be able to draw on the food shortage either as a recruiting tool or
wow. So I mean, that's a really so now you actually the security situation, terrorism gets worse. I mean, you can recruit based off of the crisis. I mean, that's
assuming al-Shabaab is able to put food in people, and they focused a lot on governance. So governance and tax collection, they really want to supplant the Somali government, such as it is, which is already in a fragile position. So
and that makes sense. I think I read somewhere that the largest buyer of, or one of the largest buyers of Ukrainian, specifically grain, was the World Food Program that was supplying specifically to a lot of these MENA and kind of African Horn governments. And so those are specifically the places that now have to go seek a different supplier on the market. And that's going to be really tough. I mean, that's unfortunate to think that precisely the places most at risk are precisely the ones that are going to have to find alternatives.
Yep, and those alternatives are going to be very hard to find, and they're going to be costlier. And for the states that aren't doing it through aid, so Kenya and others, they're going to have to perhaps institute subsidies, increase subsidies if they already have them, and do other things to make to try and make the cost as less painful on the end consumer as possible. And it's not clear if they'll be able to do that. Um, the other thing is Western countries are also trying to offset the rising inflation in those countries, so they
Yeah.
may not have the ability, the aid bandwidth to support
And they're sending all their extra humanitarian resources to Ukraine, and
to
then they're
Ukraine.
like,
And yep,
everybody's budgets are strained, and so I
yep,
mean it's really a tough situation globally and for everybody. And I think, I guess, not necessarily the best note to end on, but I think that unfortunately, everything that I'm seeing is telling me that this war is gonna grind on, and we could
yep,
potentially be reaching a stage where kind of neither side is willing to accept the other's terms for any kind of stable peace, and so
yep.
this could be a really drawn out conflict. So
And
something to
and
prepare for.
indeed, and a prolonged stalemate is not going to be, it's just going to make those, those issues we talked about in the African case, worse,
Yeah,
prolong them,
yeah,
um, provide opportunities for other actors. So,
yeah.
thanks for having me on this conversation, Matt.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
absolutely. Well,
really been
happy to have
helpful.
you, Charlie. Super
Yep,
helpful for me as well, and I think most
yep,
importantly, it was helpful for our listeners. So please subscribe to us. You can read us at strat4.com. Thanks for joining us for this Rain live event, and we hope you are reading our content and joining it, because we are in for the long haul on these issues, and we want to make sure that we can help you understand them better. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.